Now, one reason emotion needs to be put back in ADHD is it's always been there. For the first 170 years or more of ADHD's existence in the literature, it was there. Everybody who wrote about ADHD, back to Weichert, which you heard me talk about this morning, to Alexander Crichton, all the way up through George Still's lectures, even the early writers describing the condition we call ADHD today, had included passion, emotion, the inability to regulate your feelings, this quickness to anger, and easily frustrated were part of their definition of the condition. So it started out there. And then when we got into the 1960s, as Pat Quinn mentioned about MBD, it was there. It was one of the 5 major components of the disorder. If we look at Mark Stewart's papers, like his Scientific American article describing ADHD children, it's rife with descriptions of aggression, temper, anger, hostility, easily aroused, easily annoyed, quick to emote or arouse. Dennis Cantwell said it was one of the 5 major features of the syndrome of hyperactive children. And Paul Wender not only described it in children, but was the first to describe adult MBD. And he made it a central part of MBD, for which he was roundly criticized at the time. Because people said, well, how can you distinguish that from bipolar disorder or from mood disorder and so on? And you can, but you just had to make a more sophisticated argument for it. So what happened? I mean, all the way up through my early career, emotion was always part of this condition we were now calling ADHD. What happened was DSM-II. DSM-II came out describing ADHD then as hyperkinetic reaction of childhood. And if you go to DSM-II, which I have on my bookshelf, and you read it, it's only a paragraph, it describes ADHD as involving inattention, distractibility, hyperactivity, impulsivity. But once the official stamp of the APA was put on those criteria, emotion was abandoned and has never returned in any of the subsequent DSMs. Oh, it's occasionally mentioned in the text as possibly an ancillary related comorbidity for some people. But it's not part of the criteria, it's not part of the description of the central features of the disorder. So we have this official, if you will, abandonment of emotion after 170 to nearly 200 years of emotion being part of the disorder. I don't know why this happened. At the time, Stella Chess, a very influential child psychiatrist, was also part of this committee. She was writing papers simply saying that hyperactivity was just that, excessive motor restlessness, nothing more. So we don't quite know what happened back then. It may be that it was the fact that emotions are hard to measure. And this was the beginning of scientific child psychiatry, going out and beginning to measure things rather than just taking Freud's word for it about psychodynamics. Let's go out and actually learn something about our disorders through assessment, measurement, group studies, randomization, and so on. And emotions are much more difficult to assess than is hyperactivity. I don't know why they got rid of it. All I know is it's always been there up until the DSM abandoned it. But according to the neuroanatomy of ADHD, which is our second line of evidence, it has to be there. And we talked about this morning, so I won't spend as much time on this. But we know that there are 5 brain regions that are smaller in people with ADHD. They're at least 3 to 10% smaller, and according to the newest studies, which are looking at microstructure of white matter, it's even worse than that. But at a minimum, we're looking at much smaller regions that are much less mature in their development by about 2 to 3 years. And these regions are the orbital frontal cortex, the midline anterior cingulate, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum. Now, because the frontal lobes are smaller, especially on the right, then the bundle of fibers that connects the 2 hemispheres would be smaller, and that's the corpus callosum. So the anterior part of the corpus callosum is also smaller in these individuals, but that's a byproduct. And by the way, ADHD, although it involves an immaturity in both frontal lobes, is twice as bad in the right as it is in the left. And we even see that in our studies of working memory. Nonverbal working memory is twice as impaired in this disorder as is verbal working memory. They're both impaired, but the nonverbal is substantially worse, fitting in with a right hemisphere view that ADHD is much more lateralized into the right than it is in the left hemisphere, but it affects both hemispheres. It's not exclusively